Okay, I would say, Gabi, the floor is
Okay,
yours.
okay, so let's get started. So I would like to welcome everybody to the 7th webinar on this discussion series, which focuses on tipping elements, irreversibility, and abrupt changes in the Earth system, which also includes humans. So, and today we are particularly looking at that aspect. My name is Gabi Hegerl from the University of Edinburgh. I'm also a co-lead on the Lighthouse on safe landing climates, which looks at climate risk in a rapidly changing world. And I'm also interested, I'm particularly excited about today's meeting because I've done some research on the Dustbowl on the physical climate science side. And there's Caroline. Caroline, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Caroline Zimm from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, and I'm here representing the Earth Commission, who is co-organizing this event series.
Okay, so the goal of this discussion series is to advance knowledge on tipping elements and support efforts to increase consistency in the treatment of these tipping elements and rapid changes and irreversibility in the climate system, in the scientific community, but also develop a research agenda and design joint experiments and ideas for a tipping element model into comparison project. And so the first webinar in this series provided an overview over tipping elements in the climate system. And since then, we have covered a whole lot of really exciting talks for example, on the Amazon rainforest and the possibility of it rapidly transitioning out of being a rainforest, permafrost, ice sheets, changes in the ocean include they were all really exciting. And so from today onwards, we will move towards interconnections between Earth and the human system, which has been quite important in past tipping or past rapid changes. So I'm really excited that we are going down this route. And you can register for the coming events using the link in the chat box. And you can also find past recordings of events on the YouTube channel. And there will also eventually be a link to a Miro board where you can, if you have thoughts on what goes beyond just questions on today's talks, but is more how should we develop this research agenda, or which topic do you think should be really looked at, it would be great if you can add it to the Miro board. So before introducing the speakers, I'll give a quick overview of the 3 organizations that have initiated this discussion series. The Earth Commission, where Caroline is a global team of scientists with the mission to define a safe and just corridor for people and the planet, which will inform setting targets for a stable and safe planet and will help us developing and understanding pathways that are compatible with those targets. AIMS also sponsors this series, is the analysis, integration, and modeling of the Earth System project, which is basically a collaboration of scientists or a network composed of Earth system scientists and scholars that seek to develop interdisciplinary ways to understand the complexity of the natural world and its interactions with human activities. So AIMS is very interested in this link to human, to society, and both AIMS and the Earth Commission are hosted by Future Earth, which is a global network of scientists, researchers, and innovators that collaborate for a more sustainable planet. And is facing towards a sustainable and equitable world for all, where societal decisions are informed by openly accessible and shared knowledge. And Future Earth aims to advance research in support of these transformations to global sustainability that provide good and fair lives for all within the Earth system. And finally, the Safe Landing Climate Lighthouse activity is a lighthouse activity, so a kind of a forward-facing novel research area of the World Climate Research Program that has started about 2 years ago and explores routes to safe landing spaces for human and natural systems. And I'm co-leading it together with Stephen Sherwood, and it will explore future pathways that avoid dangerous climate change. And part of that avoiding is also to understand what dangerous climate change is and where tipping elements and rapid changes come in. And now I will pass over to the other chair for today, which is Caroline.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Gabi. Before we go to our first speaker today, a short overview of how we want to enjoy the next 90 minutes and how we want to interact. We'll have two presentations, so both speakers will present before we then move the Q&A session. During their talks, you can pose your questions in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote them so that we can see which questions are most preferred from the audience. That's at the bottom of the Zoom window. After the questions, we will then discuss them in these Q&A sessions. And please also use the Miro board that we already pasted into the chat window. There you can ask more broad questions that we should also address maybe in the discussion series or informing the research community in general. We will also keep this Miro board link open after the seminar, so you can go back to this during the week. And the recording and the slides will be shared after this event in a couple of days online. And now I think we will go, let's start. Richard, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Richard Hornbeck. He is Duane Rath Professor for Economics at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Richard is an economic historian and applied microeconomist whose research focuses on the historical development of the American economy. He views history as informing why some places and some people have become wealthier while others have remained poorer, which can provide perspective on what factors might drive widespread improvements in living standards. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, affiliated with programs on the development of the American economy, development economics, and environmental and energy economics. And he will share with us today insights from his work on the Dustbowl and how it is an example of interconnections between Earth and social tipping. So we are very happy to have Richard here with us to share his insights. And thank you, Richard, for being here. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk with you all. So my research looks at the Dustbowl as an episode of rapid, substantial, and permanent environmental change. And so following this environmental collapse, what I've been interested in is how the economy, how people look to adapt or not to this particular shock. And so like what might happen within the agricultural sector, within other sectors of the economy in terms of migration and the selection of those migrants and what those migration responses look like. And so in the 1930s, there was this phenomenon in the United States known as the Dust Bowl, which was an episode of large-scale erosion, both water erosion, but also particularly wind erosion, that swept large amounts of topsoil from the American plains. And so there were many areas across the American plains, the sort of central region of the United States, that lost more than 75% of their original topsoil by the end of the 1930s. And so along with this, there's two papers that I wanted to sort of briefly talk about today. One paper of mine from 2012 that looks at the persistent impacts that the Dust Bowl had on more eroded counties relative to less eroded counties. And the paper starts by showing that there were substantial decreases in agricultural land values, but also similar size decreases in agricultural revenues, which suggests that if land values are capitalizing the future revenues or future profits that people could get from the land, at least markets at that time were anticipating that the effects of the Dust Bowl were going to be quite persistent. And indeed, I find that there was quite limited and slow adaptation within the agricultural sector, that some crops productivity were affected more than others. Cropland productivity decreased more than pasture, but there was relatively limited and slow adaptation of shifting land from some production activities to others. Most of the adjustment that took place was through relative population declines in more eroded counties relative to less eroded counties. And then there's a second paper I want to talk about that looks at that population movement more using more newly available data from the census population that tracks people. And it looks at the full count of everybody in the United States in 1940. And there's information on where people were in 1935. And so it gives us an opportunity to examine this movement of people, which I think since then have, and even at that time, became these sort of archetypal environmental refugees. And so I think as a stand-in for environmental collapse, people often use this imagery of sort of large dust storms, large-scale erosion sort of collapse the environment, and then these migrants, these refugees that are displaced by that erosion, by that local environmental collapse. And these Dust Bowl migrants took on an immediate cultural and social significance through like the music of Woody Guthrie, photography of Dorothea Lange, perhaps most famously through Steinbeck's novels, And I think it's just been a very important imagery that's shaped what we think about this idea of environmental refugees. And so I wanted to look at that further and understand more about what these migration responses to permanent environmental collapse might be, because it looks like that's going to be sort of probably the primary margin through which local areas adapt to these rapid, substantial, and permanent collapses in the environment. So here's a picture of what one of these dust storms would look like. And in the aftermath of these storms, there would just be substantial erosion. So topsoil and sand and silt would be swept up against buildings. It would be pushed out of the region entirely. Some of these large dust storms even blanketed the east coast of the United States with topsoil from the American plains. And so along with this was very vivid imagery. This is a Dorothea Lange photo of particular migrant families, and especially migrant families that went to California took on a particular, I think, cultural significance and sort of represented this breakdown of American society at this time. And so, yeah. So the 2012 paper examines the impacts on the eroded counties themselves. So what the short run costs were, how much that short run cost was mitigated over time, which margins adjusted, and what conditions affected the extent of that adjustment. I'm only going to be able to touch on this briefly today. And then the later paper is examining the Dust Bowl migrants themselves. So how much did the Dust Bowl impact migration rates themselves, not just changes in total population in these counties? How did the Dust Bowl in particular, though, change the selection of migrants? And so there's a sense of, in normal times, particular people tend to migrate. And in general, in the United States, it tends to be more educated people that migrate across places. So in general, economists will talk about migration as being positively selected along the dimension of education, and that more educated people tend to migrate more. And what we're going to see is that in response to the Dust Bowl, it was a somewhat unusual migration, in particular in that it was much more negatively selected migration along the dimension of education. And so people that were leaving because of the Dust Bowl were in general less educated than people that migrate overall. Another sort of margin along which you might think migrants would vary is sort of their exposure to the agricultural sector. So how often farmers move. And so in the United States, farmers actually tend to migrate much less than other people because they own land or they're otherwise working on land. They tend to be more fixed to particular places. They tend to be much less likely to migrate. But we don't see that with the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl pushed out people sort of similarly from an agricultural background and from a non-agricultural background. And then, you know, as just a final capstone to this paper, the initial paper looked at the impact of the Dust Bowl on more eroded counties. And this next paper can track both people that have remained in those counties and also moved to other counties. And so we can look at what the ultimate impacts of the Dust Bowl were on people themselves, including both those that migrated and those that didn't migrate. And so I'm going to find that the ultimate impacts on people's wages by 1940 was actually relatively small. Most of the impact was on the land itself. And, you know, it suggests that sort of one of the important margins and perhaps successful margins in terms of mitigating relative impacts on people's incomes was the fact that people could migrate. And so I think we're going to see very different impacts of this sort of environmental collapse on land and places versus impacts on people once ultimately there can be migration. Now, of course, I think the migration within the United States is taking place within a country without formal barriers to migration itself. And so if you think about migration across countries and sort of other settings where there might need to be a cross-national migration, there might be a lot more political impediments to what that migration would look like. But I think this gives us an opportunity to see, without those political impediments, what would the sort of natural migration response look like when people are given the option? And so it kind of helps us understand what the pressure would be for migration and different sorts of migrants. Because of course, different sorts of people migrating generate different political backlash. They generate different responses by host countries, by natives in host countries. And so I think that's part of this understanding. So the Dust Bowl, I think, is a useful setting to explore because it's this classic environmental shock. It has very large and geographically differentiated impacts where we don't just have one large aggregate area that was affected. We sort of can empirically compare more and less affected places to understand what its effects were. It was largely unanticipated, and it was a largely permanent change in the local natural environment itself. And then we can explore what the sort of social economic responses to that were. There's also excellent county level data in these settings on erosion intensity. So the US Geological Survey, the Soil Erosion Service, collected erosion data during and after the 1930s. And I can merge that with county level data from the Census of Agriculture and Population on agricultural outcomes and decisions and population. And then, of course, there's individual level data from the US Census of Population in 1940, which is now available in the 100% sample, which also gives people their 1930, which also tells us people's 1935 location. And so we don't have to match people across different waves of the census. We can directly see where people were in 1935. And so some people might have migrated before 1935. And my first paper finds that people continue to migrate through the 1940s and even into the 1950s. But this gives us a window into a sort of a core middle period of this Dust Bowl migration phenomenon. Right. So the drought, to understand kind of the environmental precursors for this and what happened. So there was a large drought that began in the United States in 1931 and persisted over a number of years. And it was both the magnitude and persistence of this drought that contributed greatly to the Dust Bowl happening, along with after World War I, when agricultural production fell in Europe and there was a lot of demand for wheat and imported goods from the United States, there was a big expansion of agricultural production in the United States with increased land being cultivated, brought into wheat, corn, and other crops. So there's a big increase in agricultural intensity. And the combination of a lot of natural grasses being tilled and replaced with crops, the combination of that with severe drought over a long period of time, and particularly severe droughts in 1934 and 1936, contributed to a substantial loss in ground cover. And along with that, with these high winds in the plains region, this sort of snowballed and sort of tipped into this Dust Bowl phenomenon. And you had these sustained large-scale dust storms. It was the wind erosion itself are probably the most known phenomena, but there were occasional heavy rains during this period. And given that the ground was so hard from the drought and from the turned grasses, that would contribute to water erosion, where sort of large rains would lead to runoff and topsoil would be swept from the land that way as well. But it generated substantial local variation throughout the plains. So it's not that the whole region was affected by this shock. Some places were affected more than others, but these effects were quickly understood to be permanent. And so here's a map that was created that I geo-referenced and digitized on which places were more or less eroded. So the darker shaded counties here lost more than 75% of their original topsoil. The medium shaded counties lost between 25 and 75% of their topsoil, and the light shaded counties lost less than 25% of their topsoil. And so the thought experiment of this paper is that I want to compare more eroded counties to less eroded counties within the same state, and that had similar agricultural characteristics prior to the 1930s. So looking to match up counties that had similar agricultural intensity, population, crops that they were growing in 1910, 1920, 1925, 1930, and compare some that got more eroded through the 1930s to some that got less eroded through the 1930s, and trace out what happened to agricultural decisions and agricultural outcomes, and then what happened to migration. And so the sorts of estimates that I'm going to look at is what happened to particular outcomes, why, in counties that experienced a larger share in medium erosion areas or a larger share in high erosion areas relative to low erosion. So we're going to be able to read this off as what happened to sort of highly eroded counties relative to low erosion counties, or medium erosion counties relative to low erosion counties within the same state. So controlling for state by time fixed effects, and within the same general agricultural characteristics. So controlling for a vector of county characteristics interacted with time. Right? And the way that you can read out these figures is that land values were changing relatively similarly in these more eroded versus less eroded counties from 1910 into 1930. But then by 1940, there was a substantial drop of about 30% in high erosion counties and 20% in medium erosion counties relative to low erosion counties. So there's a substantial drop in agricultural land values, which largely persisted over time. So up through even into the 1990s, the areas in these more eroded counties are less valuable in high erosion counties relative to low erosion counties. And I do some work in the paper to look also at agricultural revenues and compare the relative impacts on these things and show that these effects were quite persistent. And why were these effects persistent? Well, in large part, there wasn't as much adaptation to this shock as some writers, I think historically, have suggested. So if you look at the total fraction of land that's in farms in these counties, in high erosion and versus low erosion counties, or medium erosion versus low erosion counties, there really wasn't much change in terms of the overall fraction of land in these counties that was in farmland, that was in farms. Now, there was a shock to the relative productivity of wheat versus hay, but relatively little shift in the fraction of land that was allocated to wheat versus hay. It was really only a generational shift, maybe 20, 25, 30 years later, where you started to see some downward shift in the fraction of farmland that was being allocated to wheat versus hay. And so it looks like there were some adjustments that people could have done, but it took place, only over sort of subsequent generations. And whether that's because there was physical capital that needed to depreciate or human capital that needed to depreciate, just different practices that people had to adopt, it needed sort of new farmers, different farmers. And it only happened really once farms started to consolidate more. And I think it suggests that sort of changes in farm ownership might have played an important role. Right? So just to summarize, it finds persistent costs within the agricultural sector, with largely persistent impacts because agricultural land use itself did not change very much. Most of what changed is that there was a drop in population in these counties. And so what I look at then in this second paper is looking to characterize the Dust Bowl migrants themselves. So who moved in response to this permanent, unanticipated environmental shock? And I think there's good reasons to think that all three of these things affect who would move after a particular economic shock. It matters that it's a shock to the environment and agricultural sector. It matters that it's unanticipated because there's less ability for migrants to make anticipatory investments, expecting that they might move. So one reason, for example, that more educated people might migrate more is that people that anticipate they're going to migrate might get additional education, might get additional degrees or do additional things because they know that that human capital they're getting might have a higher payoff in the new location that they're going relative to where they might be at the moment. And so there's a lot of sense in which sort of migration responses in response to these unanticipated large agricultural shocks might be different than migration responses that we see during more normal economic times. And so what I look at in the paper is do the same sort of regressions that I did on the agricultural sector, but looking at that interacted with migration. And so looking at how migrants differ from non-migrants in general, but then looking in particular at how migrants from high erosion counties differ from migrants from low erosion counties, how migrants from medium erosion counties differ from migrants from low erosion counties, looking within the same state and within those same agricultural characteristics and within those same pasts. So the thought experiment is the same. We're going to compare more eroded counties to less eroded counties within the same state and with a similar agricultural history and look at how that changes the nature of migration itself. Right? And so what I find is that just to start, indeed, there was more migration out of these more eroded counties. And one thing that's been of some contention recently is that indeed there was more migration to California. So migration to California from the plains in general was relatively rare. Most people moved within the plains or to other particular counties, but this relatively rare phenomenon of migrating to California became much more likely after this particular shock. And these migrants were differently selected. So in general, migrants tend to be positively selected in terms of they tend to be more educated, but that was less so for migrants from more eroded places. And migrants from Dust Bowl counties themselves seem to be particularly negatively selected with less education. They weren't substantially more agricultural though. It looks that like this contributed to a general decline of population in these counties. When I compare, so this is what I call out selection, how migrants compare to people that didn't migrate. There's another phenomenon we could think of is in selection, is how do migrants differ from natives in their new destinations? So if we compare people that are in particular counties in California where migrants are going, how different are the migrants from those people that they find themselves next to in their new location? And so these Dust Bowl migrants in particular have a much more agricultural past, that people tended to show up in places where the natives weren't on farms at such a high degree, and they had been on farms much more. So they developed a reputation for having come from agricultural areas and having been farmers, even though it wasn't farmers themselves that were more likely to migrate. And so I think that kind of reconciles how, observers of these migrants in California saw them as farmers, but it wasn't that farmers themselves were more likely to leave. It's just that they were much more likely to have been farmers than the people in those California counties where they went. And they largely shifted away from agriculture by 1940. So there was a pretty substantial movement of people out of the agricultural sector into sectors that looked more like the places where they were going. These Dust Bowl migrants struggled substantially in their new locations in the sense that these Dust Bowl migrants in particular had much lower incomes than natives in their new destinations. So they looked much poorer relative to those around them. But also all migrants looked much poorer relative to those around them, especially in California. And there were more migrants that were coming from the Dust Bowl areas. And so these Dust Bowl migrants got a reputation for being particularly poor. But we kind of see that if we look at the impacts on people themselves, there wasn't actually that much of an impact on these people's incomes in 1939 or 1940 relative to those from less eroded counties. And so it doesn't look like the migrants themselves are poorer as a consequence of the Dust Bowl. It's just that migrants in general in 1940 were quite poor in the United States, and in particular, sort of migrants to these counties. And so I think there's aspects of the reputation of these Dust Bowl migrants that look true in the data, but there's aspects also that are a little bit more nuanced and sort of come out more once we look at the data. So it's true that there was more migration. They were less positively selected. They struggled, especially in California, but not relative to those that didn't migrate, or not relative to those that were migrating from less eroded counties. When you compare everybody from less eroded counties to everybody from more eroded counties, including both those that migrated and those that didn't. Okay, so that's just where I want to finish up there. And if you want more details on all these things, there's a published paper from 2012, and there's a working paper from 2021 that I'm looking to revise right now. And so you can look at both of those for more details there. All right, thanks very much.
Thanks so very much. So the plan is that we have the question and answer session after the next talk. So, but that shouldn't prevent you from typing questions into the question sheet. So we go over to the next speaker, right, Caroline? Which is Maya.
Yeah. Gabi, are you going to introduce Michelle? Sorry.
No, you are going to do this.
Okay,
right?
sorry. Okay. Yeah. So great, thanks. It's now my pleasure to introduce Michelle Maiku, who is Professor of Urban and Regional Planning in the Department of Geomatics Engineering and Land Management at the University of the West Indies. Professor Maiku is a coordinating lead author of the Small Island Chapter 15 of the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change Working Group 2 6th Assessment Report, which was just recently published and focused on the impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation aspects of climate change. Michelle has written numerous publications which address the complex challenges of climate change and offer insights into adaptation and resilience in the context of small islands. And her work focuses on strengthening the interface between science, policy, and practice in alignment with optimal land use, infrastructure provision, and environmental management in support of sustainable human settlements. And Michelle's talk will now provide us with the current and future challenges of small island development states. So looking at what we are currently seeing and potentially in the near future, in addition to Richard's perspective on the past.
So I'd like to say again, thank you to the hosts. This presentation deals with the recent findings of the Working Group 2 report from the IPCC. And it is my pleasure to share with you specifically the findings of the small island developing states, especially in regard to the tipping points and the impacts on both the ecosystems, natural systems, and the human systems. Can I have the next slide, please? Great. Okay, so according to the IPCC's assessment report, the tipping point is defined in its glossary as a level of change in system properties beyond which a system has to reorganize, and often that change could be abruptly, and it may not actually return to the original state, even if the change factors may be minimized or abated. For the climate system itself, it refers to a critical threshold when global or regional climate changes from one stable state to another stable state. And that's in the context that I would like to frame my presentation today, that definition of the tipping point. Can I have the next slide, please? Right, so in terms of the small island developing states, what was the key takeaway message from our report was that global warming reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius in the near term will cause unavoidable impacts in multiple climate hazards, be it hurricanes or what is known as tropical cyclones, or in terms of the associated flood events, storm surges, etc. And that even going beyond that 1.5 degrees Celsius can present multiple risks to our ecosystems and ultimately to human beings. In other words, it's a code red. If we go beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius cap, small islands will actually face an existential threat if global warming rises above that 1.5 degrees Celsius. And there are significant implications for us. Next slide, please. When we look at our ecosystems, our natural system, in other words, and our biodiversity, we are quite familiar with the fact that small islands have a rich biodiversity. The terrestrial ecosystems within insular biodiversity hotspots, which include small islands, are threatened by climate change. What exactly are we talking about? Next slide. In terms of a tipping point, we see that a large population reduction and 100% of island endemics, those are species found nowhere else on Earth, across the biodiversity hotspots such as small islands will face extinction by 2100 for more than 3 degrees Celsius. So this idea that moving beyond the 1.5 and going as far as 3 degrees Celsius warming has serious consequences for our endemic species. We can lose at least 100%. And the thing about terrestrial ecosystems is that the species will not be able to migrate to other places because, you know, islands are insular, and even on the more rugged islands, the species will not move from the low-lying plains to the more topographically challenged areas in the mountains and so on. It's very difficult for them to migrate because as you migrate higher up, it gets narrower and narrower in terms of the topography. So that it affects the migration of the species. They have nowhere else to go. Next slide, please. The marine ecosystems are particularly vulnerable. And here we're talking about coral reefs. Under future climate scenarios, small islands will experience severe coral bleaching on an annual basis before 2040. And as you know, we're in 2022. Above 1.5 degrees Celsius globally, and including our small islands, our assessment projected that there will be a further loss of about 70 to 90% of reef building corals. And we can even reach as much as 99% of corals being lost under warming of 2 degrees Celsius or more above the pre-industrial period. So again, this is a tipping point for us. This is code red. If global warming transiently exceeds 1.5 degrees Celsius in the coming decades, or even later, in other words, there's an overshoot, the damage will be irreversible because these are very fragile ecosystems and they take a long time to recover. And if there is no potential for lowering those temperatures, they're going to die off. Next slide, please. So I turn to the question of the tipping point and implications for human systems. What we find in small island states is that we do have climate sensitive economic sectors such as tourism and fisheries, and these depend on obviously the coral reefs. So the very economic survival of small islands is at risk if the coral reefs die off, and our tourism sector, which generates revenue for us, and the very fisheries that are dependent on coral reefs for their nurseries and, habitat, that can die off, and that will be the collapse of some of our economies. Next point, slide, please. And of course, these are the graphic representations. When we say economic survival, we're talking about people's livelihoods, traditional livelihoods being lost on account of global warming and coral reef damage. Next slide, please. There are also some interesting projections for us in that drought risk projections for the Caribbean, for example, indicate that a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, any change from 1.7 degrees Celsius to 2.7 degrees Celsius could result in a 60% increase in the number of people who will experience severe water stress, anywhere between 2043 and 2071. So in other words, a 1 degree Celsius change can result in as much as 60% of our population being impacted by water shortages between 2043 and 2071. Next slide, please. This has significant implications both for food and water security. Human survival in small islands is threatened if there is drought, because of course we can't grow our typical agricultural crops that are dependent on irrigational supplies. And of course, if there is a rising of sea levels on account of the melting of the glaciers, we can experience a salinization of freshwater resources, which will significantly impact on human health and well-being. So we are facing some significant challenges in the future. Next slide, please. Again, in terms of human systems, our cities and human settlements are already vulnerable, and they are facing the risks of changes in the sea level rise. Many of our coastal cities and rural communities have a coastal orientation, and they've already been impacted by sea level rise, heavy precipitation events, much more intense tropical cyclones of category 5 or 4, and the related storm surges. In fact, as of 2017, we found that 22 million people in the Caribbean alone live below 6 meters in elevation. And in the Pacific, you're talking about 50 to 60% of their population living in what is called these low elevation coastal zones. So climate change is going to impact significantly on our human settlements, infrastructure, health, well-being, food security, economies, especially through these compound events of tropical cyclones, storm surges, coastal flooding, etc. So across the sectors in our regions, we are also very particularly vulnerable in terms of the more marginalized, vulnerable people in our communities. And we are already observing that they are disproportionately affected by these sorts of potential tipping points. Next slide, please. In the worst case scenario, if this tipping point is reached, you can actually find that some of the atoll islands in the future may become uninhabitable. They will have no freshwater resources, suffer from tremendous drought. As you know, the Bahamas, for example, this is a satellite imagery of the Bahamas. It is one of the most low-lying coastal capitals in the world, in the top 5 actually. And it means that they will have to be, the population may have to be relocated to some of the other islands that may not be so vulnerable, but generally the Bahamas is very much at risk if the tipping point is arrived at. I know Richard covered migration. Our data does not allow us to track migration. We tried our best within our small island territories to track what was happening. But generally, people migrate not because of climate change. They move for economic reasons or for educational purposes. But what we are seeing is internal migration, or what is called more or less displacement on account of storm surges and coastal flooding and so on. We're seeing it in Fiji and Vanuatu and Kiribati and so on in the South Pacific. But worst case scenario is that they become uninhabitable. No fresh water, droughts, no food crops can be grown, coral reefs die off, etc. Next slide, please. I think that might be the last slide. So just to summarize, we are, the climate change report that we recently produced says code red for all countries across the planet, but the small islands are particularly vulnerable and urgent action is needed to reduce the carbon emissions and to take concerted action to ensure that our critical ecosystems are not damaged and that the implications for our human systems would be addressed in the short term as a matter of priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everybody, please keep the questions coming in the question and answer part. We have had a lot of questions for Richard, and I'm sure there will be more questions for Michelle coming. I think some of the questions have been largely answered, but I would like to ask Richard to verbally answer the question on the role of New Deal conservation policies, because I think that's a quite interesting and complex subject, and how you address how the government action helped or hindered the recovery from this from the Dust Bowl. Would you like to answer that one in person?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so in the 1930s, you know, partly in response to the Depression, partly in response to the Dust Bowl, and I think often using the Dust Bowl as an excuse, the political administration in the United States looked to pass various agricultural policies that would prop up prices and restrict agricultural production. And so I think some of this was done under the guise of, you know, conservation and, you know, reducing agricultural production, largely with the motivation of increasing prices and trying to benefit farmers during the Great Depression. And so I think perhaps surprisingly to me that my first paper in 2012 found that there were substantial efforts to restrict agricultural production, convert land to grassland, do various policies, but these weren't particularly differential across more eroded and less eroded counties within the United States. And I think this is consistent with some work that people have done that shows various political motivations in implementing these policies and this spending, that it wasn't and it seems more driven by that rather than being particularly differential across more eroded and less eroded counties. And then in terms of the role that these New Deal policies might play in affecting migration, there's some ongoing work that I'm doing right now with the migration data to look at potentially how the selection of migrants might vary with these agricultural policies. So there's been some interesting work, for example, showing that some of these policies to restrict agricultural production, perhaps predictably, you know, decreased demand for labor and pushed people off the land. And so that probably contributed to migration overall, and how that interacted with erosion and affected the selection of migrants is something that I'm going to look to explore.
Thank you, Richard. Following this discussion on migration, I have two questions for Michelle. The first is my own question. You mentioned that data is an issue in SIDS, small island development states, so that you're currently not able to track the migration that is happening so far. And do I understand correctly that following this data challenge that because you mentioned that migration is happening because of education and economic reasons, but that you don't see now that people are already moving away from the coastal zones? or at least this is not the motivation. It might be because of economic impact on their daily lives. If you could reflect on this data issue.
Yes, right. So the what we found is that we haven't had sufficient time series data to determine whether people were what you call climate refugees or climate migrants. What we are sure of is that we are seeing people moving for, as I said, economic reasons in search of, better jobs or better education. We see that very often in the Caribbean, people migrating to North America and Europe, and in the case of the Pacific, moving to New Zealand and Australia. But as I said, the actual data to show that their movement is motivated by climate change impacts, we've not been able to ascertain that. However, there is displacement internally, not outward migration to other countries, but movement away from the coast where you are seeing sea level is rising and people moving away from the coast. Some of it is actually voluntary movement. Other movement is planned relocation or planned resettlement in the case, for example, of Fiji, where we have seen that example, where the state is removing villages from the coastal areas. I hope that answers your question, Caroline.
Okay, let's move with one question from the audience to Richard. This is from Tim Lenton. Learning from the past, what policies and finance mechanisms could help reduce the negative human impacts of the code rent impacts of climate change and displacing people? So this is for both you, Richard, but also for Michelle, and I will post it for Michelle also in the box. Maybe she can then reply after you. So the policies and finance mechanisms.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the two main things that I've been focused on is, just first of all, allowing the migration itself to take place. That I think this Dustbowl migration phenomenon happened within the United States, where it's such a large country with opportunities to move to other places that were relatively less affected. But if we think about a lot of places around the world, places where there might be smaller countries, where a lot of that migration would take place across national borders, there's often more impediments to that migration. And so just allowing people to move is probably the main starting point. And then probably, as another mechanism, allowing agricultural goods to flow across counties and just sort of allowing for trade and products that might become more scarce to try to mitigate, food security issues or other the availability of goods that are maybe increasingly more difficult to produce in certain parts of the world.
Maybe I can ask a question from Mike that is, I think, a natural follow-on on this one. For both for Richard and Michelle, so that would assume that the places where people migrate to are welcoming those refugees. So we can have seen in the past that this works sometimes and sometimes not so much. So how can we prepare populations for the arrival of such migration? Maybe starting.
Yeah, so and even within the United States, there was quite a backlash in California to migrants coming from the plains. I think unusual in the US context is that there are cases of roadblocks that were set up in Southern California and places to try to turn back migrants from Oklahoma. People were settled in sort of work camps and sort of like particular kind of refugee camps. And yeah, so there was a lot of resistance. I think in part it's because these migrants were unusually negatively selected in terms of years of education and income and these sorts of characteristics that I think most of the time migration gets smoothed over because the people that are arriving are relatively more educated, relatively higher income. And yeah, I think those tensions get exacerbated when it's poorer people that are coming. And what might prepare people for this I think that's ultimately, a political question that I'm not very well prepared to answer, but, it's just sort of, depends on the population and the culture and the place, but just becoming accepting and looking to encourage people to, make those opportunities. And, why have people been a lot more welcoming of Ukrainian refugees than Syrian refugees? I think, there's a lot of things that we could speculate about there. But yeah, like what would encourage those actions, what would encourage those things is something I think governments are going to have to really focus on.
Yes, particularly with the emergence of climate change preferentially occurring in low-lying latitudes and in developing countries.
In the meantime, Richard, there's two questions on the Dustbowl. One from Nebojana Kecenovic on, do you think that the confluence of the Great Depression and the aftermath of the Dustbowl magnified the tipping or led to a cascade of the two events?
Yeah, I think from a physical science point of view, the environmental phenomenon itself is actually like what led to the Dustbowl itself is, I think, much less about the depression in the 1930s and much more about the boom in agricultural production like during and after World War I in the United States, and increased cultivation, increased use of machinery. And so, but I think that certainly the impacts of the Dustbowl happening within the depression affected very much the opportunities that people would have that they could move into. And so the struggles that people found themselves in California were in part, for sure, a depression phenomenon.
Okay, I think Michelle is still reading the chat box question I sent to her. Just a quick one, Richard, on the possibilities of a second Dustbowl coming up from today's perspective, if you could share with us any insights on this. Can a Dustbowl happen again, and how could this be avoided?
Yeah, so one question that sometimes comes up in this context is the 1950s, there was a drought. There was drought also in the central United States. And so some people have pointed to the fact that a second Dustbowl didn't occur in the 1950s to sort of say that there's been enough adaptation of agriculture and new agricultural practices that something like that wouldn't happen again. And I don't know that we can say that necessarily, because the drought in the 1950s wasn't as long and as severe as the drought in the 1930s, but perhaps there were some changes in practices. I don't know that a Dustbowl itself would necessarily happen again. And certainly the share of the US economy that's in agriculture is very different then. So it would have a very different political context. But of course, across other countries and other settings, I don't think it's hard to imagine certain environmental collapse in parts of the world where large populations, particularly places that are very dependent on agriculture, might get displaced and might experience large-scale migration pressure. And so, I think a lot of the work that I've seen is work by Esteban Rossi-Hansberg and others sort of talking about how central the role of migration will be in large-scale adaptation to the environmental collapse that's almost inevitably going to occur at this point, it looks like. And so I think we should expect these large movements that are going to look different than other movements of people that otherwise occur.
So can I ask Daniel Ustinow's question for, I think might be for both questions, for both the groundswell report from the World Bank estimated internal climate migration hotspots emerging as early as the 2030s. So what type of mechanism should we put in place in order to enhance enhanced preparation for this? And in the face of this expected climate migration, how should we prepare for this? And that might again be interesting for both. Maybe starting with Richard.
Sure. I think I imagine general policies that support migrants. Mushfiq Mubarak and co-authors have a number of interesting papers on, what encourages migration, what enables it.
Maybe I can be cheeky and ask a question of Richard in the meantime. Richard, I've often wondered what was the long-term societal response to the Dustbowl. So did they, for example, did it change the plains politically? How did they deal with there was quite a severe government intervention during the Dustbowl to prevent further erosion. So did that change the perception of government regulation in in that region? And did it change the political landscape?
Yeah, I haven't seen any, I haven't seen particular indication of that. You know, I've seen more recent work about the migration of people from the South to the Midwest and to the plains. I haven't seen much about the plains themselves, politics being shaped by that movement of people. I can imagine various effects it had within California. And so, you know, there was sort of a minor socialist move. There was a socialist movement sort of within the United States during the Depression in response to this economic collapse. And I think, you know, within California, then a backlash to that. But that imagery of these migrants in California sort of went across the country as well. But I think ultimately that backlash was sort of stalled by the Roosevelt administration's policy response and sort of what the government was doing in terms of like more social programs that were put in place. And so you didn't see sort of a full left movement in the United States that might have potentially happened, because there was sort of a partial movement left to try to ameliorate, you know, some of those issues. And so you know, it's kind of one of the things, there's some interesting work. One of the things that sort of separates the labor movement, for example, in Europe versus the United States is that, you know, labor unions prior to this period were sort of thought of as illegal conspiracies. And in part of the sort of compromises to legalize unions within the United States in this era was, you know, they gave up certain rights of general strikes and certain types of labor powers that in Europe are more commonly used. So kind of the US sort of had this partial left-wing political movement in this era, and in part forestalled a larger left movement.
Okay. We have a question from AD. I think that hasn't been answered yet. Have you answered that one? How do we ensure the have you answered that one? I can't remember. The financing, technology, and capacity for this transition, and particularly the transformation away from fossil fuels and onto renewable energies. How can we adopt global policies that we help for an equitable energy transition that works for all countries, including developing countries?
Yeah, this is somewhat outside my area at the moment, though I think that's important. And actually a new project that I'm launching now is to try to look at the adoption of steam power and the technological transition from the use of water power, and sort of what barriers to adopting new sources of power generation might there be, and what sort of lock-in occurs by which some firms in some places, because they're using some earlier power generation technology, might then not, that create impediments to adopting the next wave of energy. And so I might have something for you in too many years, but yeah, for now, I don't have that much to contribute there.
Interesting. There might also be interesting answers in the transition from coal to oil. I think that was also a very fast transition. It's interesting. Caroline, do you want to ask one?
Have you, or do you know of work, Richard, that looked into gender differences within the impacts of the Dustbowl? If you could speak to that, that would be very interesting.
Yeah, so one of the nice things about the individual level data that I use from 1940 is that because it asks people where they were in 1935, we can follow both men and women. Whereas most of the time when people do this kind of migration analysis, they have to link data sets across waves of the census. And because women in the United States will often change their names when they get married or otherwise sort of have experienced a transition in marriage, then it can be very difficult to link women across censuses. And so one thing that I do in the migration papers, I sort of report all these estimates for men and women separately. And we see similar differences in selection in terms of their years of education. Migrants in general tend to be more likely male. But the sort of the Dust Bowl migration phenomenon itself it was sort of both men and women that were leaving, and not that differential across high erosion and low erosion counties.
Thank you. Maybe I could ask quickly an own question that has so from reading what happened and looking at the climate impacts of the Dust Bowl, it seemed to me that the incentives for the individual farmers to adapt to what was happening were exactly the wrong ones, because they were having a hard time breaking even when the drought set in, and so they plowed up more land to farm more, which was in many ways a maladaptation or a wrong response. Is that, first of all, is that a reasonable interpretation of what happened, and how can we prevent maladaptations like that, where the individual, the pressure for the individual pushes in the direction that is unhelpful for society?
Yeah, so there's a nice paper by Hansen and Leibkap, Zeynep Hansen and Gary Leibkap, that looks at that phenomenon within the Dust Bowl in the US and looks at larger farms versus smaller farms, with the idea that larger farms, because they cover a broader geographic area, might internalize more of those external benefits from preventing erosion and like leaving more land fallow and otherwise taking these preventative efforts. And so, the general economic intuition is that when you might do things that would not just benefit you, but benefit others in the surrounding area, also those things are going to be privately under-provided. And so there could be a policy response to try to encourage people to do these things that would benefit others as well.
Caroline, do you want to go with Nakis or?
That one we actually already, oh, there's a new one. Oh, right. Yeah, sure. Another one from Naki. So for Richard, related to the source of power in farming, or are appliances that could be attached to the 4T so that it served basically as a tractor these days? Is this something you studied, and how pervasive it was? So farming appliances connected to the 4T model, a very specific question from Naki.
Yeah, so I didn't look that much at sort of tractor use and mechanization, given the available data in the Census of Agriculture. But some of those differences in use and implements and such, I mean, that's going to be built into the what crops people are growing and whether they're growing crops at all or whether they're leaving the land in pasture. I find some suggestive evidence that access to banks, and in particular banks that didn't collapse during the Great Depression, might have enabled somewhat more adaptation. So it's possible that sort of the ability to adopt new capital equipment would play an important role. And so I think just as people might be locked into certain physical capital that precludes them adapting and changing what crops they grow, I think also not just physical capital, but just the human capital and how do you grow particular crops, what sorts of crops are you knowledgeable about, and how do you want to do that, is going to be very persistent and slow to change.
Super, thank you. Even that specific question. I think Gabi mentioned that the question that Sophie had, which was more targeted from Michelle, but I think we can also ask this for Richard, in the sense of the motivation factors for migration, so the push factors. Is there any data from personal accounts or so on the Dust Bowl migration that you looked into, besides sheer survival, I would say, or poverty?
Yeah, at the time, actually, I mean, some survey evidence was collected even immediately about who was migrating, where they were coming from. There wasn't a lot of focus, though, that people put on trying to ask, well, why are you migrating? I think it's just because the assumed understanding was that people were looking for jobs, they were looking for economic opportunities, and they had been displaced by this sort of decreased agricultural potential and decreased just general economic activity and eroded places. And so, yeah, but like I think more broadly, given that migration in general tends to have such large returns, understanding why do people not migrate is a question that's gone back a very long time. And that's where also, so I'll point you to some work by Mushfiq Mubarak and co-authors, sort of really trying to explore why people might not migrate and what the potential returns to migration are and what impacts that might have. And so this is a very striking paper where he and others show that giving people just bus tickets, money for bus tickets and relatively small amounts of money to explore the potential of moving to the city in a seasonal way seems to have really large impacts on seasonal migration. And again, that work is much more focused on seasonal migration, whereas I'm focused on permanent migration of people sort of permanently transplanting themselves somewhere else. And there's reason to think that those phenomena might be different as well.
Thank you. So I think we have had a few more questions, but I'm not sure if we want to go much longer into this session. I think the next question takes us into a slightly different direction. So I think this is a good place to wrap it up. I think it's been really informative and interesting, particularly also to look at the migration aspect of the Dustbowl, which I wasn't I was aware of it, but it was really interesting to hear about the research on it. And I think we better think carefully about this. If you look at interviews with people, for example, in the UK, on economic versus war migrants, I think we have a hill to climb in terms of what will happen if we have migration in response to extreme events and droughts in developing countries. So it's been super interesting for me. And maybe Caroline would like to say something as well. Would like to thank the speakers for a really engaging session and all the people for asking questions.
Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you all for being so flexible today. Even 2 years in the pandemic, we are still fighting with these technical issues. Thank you, Richard, and we will follow up with Michelle, as mentioned, also on the open questions that we were not able to answer live today, and we will post them online. The next event will take place in about a month on social tipping towards positive change, with talks by Ilona Otto from the University of Graz and Doyen Farmer from the University of Oxford. The registration is open. We hope to see many of you there. Yes, as I mentioned already, in a few days, we will upload the recording and the slides from Richard and Michelle. And we thank you all for bearing with us in this, in this session with some technical difficulties. And yeah, especially also Richard, thank you for being flexible and being cut off every now and then.
Great, thanks a lot.
And hosting the Q&A session basically on your own with us.
Oh, glad. Thanks everyone. It was good to talk to you all.
Thanks.
Thank you. And if you have ideas what needs for research, put it on the Miro board. Okay, thank you.
Bye everyone.
It's my pleasure to pose some of the questions that have come through from the audience to you, Michelle. And I will just start with the first one here. So in terms of data for understanding people's reasons for migration, is there a need for more consistent surveying to understand the push factors? As you mentioned in your presentation, that for small island states, there isn't sufficient data for climate change induced migration.
Yes, thank you, Maya. So we were not able to do much more rigorous analysis of whether migration from small island developing states was in fact driven by climate determinants, climate change impacts. We do know from historical data that people have migrated from islands for the purposes of seeking economic advancement, looking after seeking their educational progress. People migrate to be educated outside of islands. So for economic and educational reasons, people migrate, but we weren't able to pin it down to climate change specifically. So in response to the question, one of the research gaps that we have identified is that we do need to embark on a much more ambitious study using data over the coming years to help us formulate and ascertain really what is driving people to migrate. Is it in fact climate change? We are at this moment uncertain based on our assessment, and there is a need to collect data
consistently. Yeah. Do you think are there any thoughts that you have around those data collection opportunities? Do you see any specific spaces where, you know, certain types of surveys you believe could or should be brought to life in some way?
Yeah. So one of the obviously this was a hot topic when we were defending the document before governments a month ago. You know, migration became a hot topic. What happens from my own experience in the Caribbean and in the Pacific as well, my colleagues have confirmed this, is in the aftermath, let's say, of a tropical cyclone. The devastation is there, and all of the data collection is being done by governments. And so they're not going to be able to capture whether people migrate after a hurricane, for example. They're busy rebuilding, sort of recovering from the devastation of a hurricane. So the data collection is a bit poor at that stage. So the entry point, I believe, for collecting that type of data would be to, yes, capture the data as best as governments can at that point, but later on to go back and track to see whether people have moved on, migrated externally after the hurricane event. That's, I think, going to be the best way to do it. And of course, helped by relief organizations that may be on the field working with displaced persons can also assist in closing the data gap.
That ties in nicely to one of the other questions here. And I think this can be answered from many different entry points. Do you think that we need to prepare populations for the arrival of environmental migrants and plan their arrival? I mean, it's an extremely broad question. In the context of your answer to the last question, how would you answer that?
Well, first of all, what we have found, and as an islander, I can say so myself. I have lived all over the world, but I'm in pursuit of my education and so on, and to get working experience. But I've come back to my own territory. To answer that point, we are not familiar with any data that shows that people migrate because of flooding or droughts in the small island states to other territories, be they continental countries or New Zealand and Australia and so on. That there is no proof of that. So the question of preparing, maybe in the future it can come, preparing governments that if they don't take action to reduce global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, that people may actually decide they're being impacted on an annual basis and they need to migrate elsewhere. Perhaps that may come in the future, but as we speak as at this moment, islanders have an affinity for where they are born, to their culture, to their society, and they would rather stay in their own. They may migrate and for educational reasons and economic reasons, but they eventually return home. So it's not a permanent migration as far as historical accounts lead us to understand. So to focus the conversation, I think we need to look at ways of helping to ameliorate the climate change impacts on islands so that people are not forced into external migration.
Yeah, thank you. That also ties into the next question, which asks about learning from the past, and poses what policies and finance mechanisms could help reduce the negative impacts of the code red impacts you talk about in your presentation of climate change displacing people. Okay, so which policies?
Yeah. So as I emphasize code red, that urgent action is necessary to reduce carbon emissions, but of course that will take time. In the meantime, we need to craft policies that will provide incentives for the reduction of a dependency on fossil fuels. So the private sector and scientific communities, the academy, and so on, are very often engaged in research and development, not governments. And if incentives can be given for the private enterprise and the research communities to come up with the invention of new technologies to help mitigate those greenhouse gas emissions, that would be helpful. So some sort of fiscal incentive, it could be a tax rebate or other incentives, some other carrots. We've already seen it with solar energy. More and more solar energy is being used. There is, of course, wind energy, there's hydroelectric power, which is much more in the distant future. But that would be one policy that can help our shift from the use of fossil fuels that may be driving some of the carbon emissions. There is also the question of finance, financing coastal engineering to protect all the coastal infrastructure and the population, therefore, that resides along the coast. That can take the form of sometimes seawalls. We can also have investments in planned relocation, as I mentioned in the presentation. Fiji has already begun to selectively, not on a whole scale basis, but selectively relocate highly vulnerable coastal communities further inland so that they are not impacted by storm surges, coastal flooding, and some of the hurricane events that occur on an annual basis. So policy, yes, incentives, fiscal measures, investments in coastal engineering. There is also ecosystem-based adaptation that we tend to not highlight, but much of our IPCC report did show that we can use a mix of policy measures, including coastal engineering, planned relocation, and the ecosystem-based adaptation, which would be mangrove replanting, coral reef, to help the coral reefs become more resilient to some of the ocean acidification and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. These next two questions actually touch on your last answer in different ways. I think I'm going to start with the last one, actually. So this is also picking up on the kind of the economic perspectives. It names the groundswell report from the World Bank that it estimated that internal climate migration hotspots will be emerging as early as 2030. I think in your presentation, you mentioned how a lot of migration has actually been within the islands, states, and also in the Pacific, there's been movement. What type of mechanisms should be more urgently put in place in order to enhance anticipatory action in the face of expected climate migration, do you believe?
Right. So the World Bank data, as I said, came from governments. The governments were the repository of some of the data looking at whether people were migrating and so on. So we're highly dependent on that database. When they talked about the hotspots, a number of hotspots were highlighted because of course ours was a global assessment. So the hotspots that showed up were Africa, Asia, but our small islands did not actually show, we didn't have the data to show that we would be have whole-scale or large-scale migration in the next 8 years or so. So I think that World Bank report, we have to be cautioned about how we interpret that report. Our islands, small islands, did not, in our assessment, show up as a hotspot in terms of migration. That being said, though, of course, we know that with Code Red, because of the existential threat that 1.5 can mean for us in terms of tipping of the natural systems and human systems, we do need to put some measures in place as a matter of priority. Certainly, on the ecosystem side, we need to help the ecosystems as best as we can. And that means some of the anthropogenic pressures on these ecosystems will only accelerate the degradation of these ecosystems. So yes, climate change is taking place in terms of climate variability and climate change itself, but human beings are the drivers of some of the climate change. So in terms of helping the ecosystems, we need to address sewage disposal, land degradation, the cutting down of our hillsides and forests. All of those factors are contributing to coastal water pollution and not helping the corals to survive either. Of course, on the terrestrial side, the loss of rainforests would only make our coastal areas more vulnerable to coastal flooding because those forests are in the upper watersheds and they're to slow down the rate of runoff towards the coastal plains. So some of those anticipatory measures must be linked to how we manage our human activities that are impacting on these ecosystems that really need a lot of help to recover.
Yeah, absolutely. And this final question from the audience starts to touch on these interlinkages a bit more with tipping points and human and natural systems. So the gradual approach to tipping points is often perceived as great threats to the existence of small island developing states. And the question continues, looking through the lens of STI collaboration, can there be opportunities in terms of mitigation and adaptation? For example, Holland has developed technologies to have great development whilst they lie below the sea level. So that's, yeah, that's.
So with the tipping points argument, yes, we tend to, at the policy level and at governmental levels, perhaps, because of course I work in the policy domain as well, there is a tendency to react slowly. But scientifically, our assessments show that some of these changes are in the near term. There is, it's not all bad news in that we do need to seize opportunities to marry adaptation with mitigation. So again, one has to be cautioned that small islands, developing states, have very small carbon footprints. We are not the big emitters of the greenhouse gases, but we are obviously the most highly vulnerable because our ecosystems are extremely sensitive or fragile. Therein lies the answer. We still have to do our best to contain the release of carbon emissions, because of course, I come from an island where we do use fossil fuels. We are an oil-dependent economy. But generally speaking, our major work would be in terms of the adaptation work. So in terms of adaptation, Holland, they've always built and reclaimed land from the sea. They've adapted well in Holland to some of the changes. They lie below sea level. So there are some opportunities for us. We can elevate buildings in the coastal areas so that they're not inundated by floodwaters as a result of sea level rise. That is different. That is what you call in situ adaptation, where you stay in position. You're not going to be relocated, but we will adapt the building structure by elevating them on stilts, or we can do what is called flood proofing, where we can retreat. So in some islands, the land use plans actually say that we will not permit development within 25 meters of the coastline. So we're pushing back all new development away from the highly vulnerable zones. Coastal engineering is extremely expensive. An entire island cannot build a dike or a seawall like the Dutch can probably do. So again, that has to be selective, and it will be mostly our coastal capitals that are very vulnerable and where all the economic assets and population densities is highest. So let me provide a synopsis. We can only do so much in terms of mitigation because our carbon footprints are really not that high. What we can do is in terms of adaptation, and there are already 3 measures. We can protect the coastline through coastal engineering. We can accommodate by building on stilts. And we can also do what is called retreating from the coastline using land use zoning plans to say we need to go back away from the coast. But we have limited land space. And so even that presents a problem in terms of how we're going to push population away from the coast. Where do we resettle displaced persons?
Michelle, thank you very much for taking the time to answer our questions. It's been fantastic listening to both your presentation and your answers today. There are many questions more that I would love to ask, and I'm sure that we will be back in touch as we continue with this series of discussion seminars exploring the interlinkages, between human systems and earth systems. So thank you very much, Professor Michelle Mycoo, and we will speak to you again.
It's my pleasure. And I am also a member of Future Earth course. So it was my pleasure to wear 2 hats as it were today. Thank you.
We like that very much. Wonderful. Thank you.